Hey guys! So today's video is going to be a presentation by the independent journalist Eva Bartlett. Now I've posted some of her work on my channel before, and this video in particular is she goes on and talks about Syria as well as North Korea, and given the fact that the US and North Korea tensions are high, I think it's good that we have somebody who actually went on the ground there and searched and looked at things for themselves. So I hope you guys watch the video in its entirety. It's a little lengthy, but I'm the Millennial Revolt. Thank you guys so much for watching, and you have a wonderful day. Bye.
John, Peter, and Neil have already beat me to thanking Gregory Sharkey, and they also stole my lines. But I do want to echo them and give a big thanks to you, Gregory, for arranging this very important event. And I also want to echo what you said about RT, because I do contribute to RT among other platforms, and not once have I been censored by RT or told what I can say. And that is the reason I contribute to RT, because if I were to try to send an editorial or an article to the BBC or The Guardian, if they deigned to publish it, I'm sure it would be butchered. So I'm also grateful to platforms like RT. So I'm also going to note that I do have some notes prepared. However, unlike the script readers of most corporate media journalists, I wrote these myself. The reason I have my notes with me is I want to be as accurate as possible, because I'm going to be speaking first about something that is new territory to me, but I feel very strongly about it. But I want to begin with an anecdote. So recently, in one of those social media exchanges wherein a person hurls slander, but no actual argument, it was said of myself and my colleague Vanessa Beeley and Bartlett are stooges for whatever government will pay them. For the record, I have yet to receive a payment after 10 years of on-the-ground activism and writing, and I can say the same for Vanessa Beeley. And we've already heard tonight discussion of how people are slandered in an effort to discredit what they're presenting, and because perhaps they're challenging very strongly corporate media narratives. So normally I don't bother replying to such insults, but I did reply to the person's later comment, which was, "You'll happily defend a one-party military dictatorship who waste money on nuclear weapons while their people starve." So my reply was, well, I don't defend the US. I don't know what you're talking about. As prior speakers have noted, America is incessantly waging wars of aggression against sovereign nations, and soaring poverty and homelessness levels are increasing in America, which also has one of the largest prison populations in the world. And yet, all these countries we've talked about tonight are being demonized with the very same attributes that America actually holds. And this is about the American administration, not the people, because I was born in America, so I can diss the administration. But anyway, the exchange I began with was obviously regarding North Korea. And unfortunately, it's a reflection of how successful the media has been in the demonization of North Korea, and how successful the fear-mongering has been. Many people believe what's happening in North Korea is about a madman with a bad haircut and an itchy nuclear trigger finger. But no, it's not about Trump. Although he did on September 19th, 2017, vow to totally destroy North Korea. And incidentally, he did that when he was standing in the United Nations, talking about respecting states' sovereignty, while blatantly threatening the sovereignty and safety of the 25 million people of North Korea. But America, since the birth of the DPRK, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, has maintained a policy of aggression against that state, culminating in the 3 years of utter decimation in the 1950s of North Korea. Since then, the U.S. has repeatedly threatened nuclear destruction of the North and has considered the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons it had in South Korea until the 90s. In addition, the U.S. and South Korea and allies run drills called war games annually. And while U.S. officials described these twice-year assembling of significant military forces within striking range of the DPRK as routine and defensive, to North Koreans, each and every time, it could be 1950s all over again, but worse. Colin Powell in 1995 threatened to turn North Korea into a charcoal briquette, and in 2013 reiterated that threat to destroy the country. But again, not broadcast in corporate media is that America has already done this. So with 635,000 tons of bombs, including 32,557 tons of napalm, indeed turning North Korea into a charcoal briquette. Just a little bit of history context here. I'm sure most of you or all of you are perhaps very aware, but just in case you, like myself, wasn't very aware of the history of the North, retired U.S. General Curtis LeMay, who headed the Strategic Air Command during that war, said they'd burn down every town in North Korea. In his words, over a period of 3 years, we killed off, 20% of the population of Korea as direct casualties of war or from starvation. And then the American historian Bruce Cummings, who has meticulously researched the history of the U.S. involvement in the Koreas, noted for 25 years now, the world has been treated to scaremongering about North Korean nuclear weapons, but hardly anyone points out that it was the U.S. that introduced nuclear weapons into the Korean peninsula. Hundreds were kept there until a worldwide pullback of tactical nukes occurred under George Bush. Every U.S. administration since 1991 has challenged North Korea with frequent flights of nuclear-capable bombers in South Korean airspace, and any day of the week, an Ohio-class submarine could demolish the North in a few hours. Today, there are around 28,000 U.S. troops occupying South Korea, and this is obviously a threat to the North, along with the drills they do, and of course the rhetoric coming from Trump and Tillerson and others of the U.S. administration. So in addition to vilification of world leaders, also there are wild stories we're told about them. And in the case of North Korea, we hear anything from every male in the North is mandated to have the same unusual haircut as Kim Jong-un. And this is actually a story that emanates from Washington itself, from Radio Free Asia, who, much like corporate media on Syria and Libya, relied on unnamed sources for their story. So, and I was actually there in August, and I didn't see every male having the same haircut as Kim Jong-un. But other stories we've heard are that he had his potential lover executed by a firing squad. His uncle was fed and killed by a pack of wild dogs. And many outrageous stories that are designed to, deflect your attention from the real issues at hand and make you think what a crazy leader he is, and plus he's talking about firing a missile at us. But they don't give you the context of all the rhetoric and all the aggression against the North, and the fact that what the North Koreans are doing are defending themselves. And as it was said about Syria and also Iran and other countries, Libya, they did not attack other countries. It is the imperialist nations that have attacked and destroyed them. And this is what they want to do to North Korea. In an effort to hear from North Koreans and get a sense of what they had to say and what their life was like, and admittedly it was only for 1 week, I went to North Korea in August of 2017. But driving over 100 kilometers south of Pyongyang to the DMZ area, I saw the road was flanked on either side endlessly with fields of corn and rice. And this is notable because North Korea did have a famine in the 90s. And all the onus of the starvation is put on the North Korean government, with no mention of the illegal sanctions that North Korea has been under for decades. And obviously the sanctions are going to be crippling. And the fact that North Korea was decimated and has rebuilt is quite impressive. And they do have agriculture. I visited a farm there where they gave the farm workers very functioning modern houses with solar panels and solar water heaters, their own plot of land on which to grow crops, and the farmers would work collectively on the farm. Also, we're told that things like the Children's Palace in Pyongyang which has actually over 5,000 kids visit on a daily basis, and it has state-of-the-art swimming pool, offers science and sports and other cultural, dance, music, extracurricular activities. We're told that this is all just a facade, or this is something to dupe Westerners. And when I hear things like that, or hear that the Science and Tech Center, which has over 3,000 computers run on solar panels, and which offers higher education by long distance to people who live in the countryside, and they could attain their higher education with degrees by distance education. But we're told these things are all just to dupe Westerners who are coming to visit North Korea. And that, when I think about that, I think, well, you know, Kim Jong-un, whatever you think of him, he is very clear in his rhetoric. And he's not demanding your respect, or he's not demanding that you think North Korea is as a Western society. To the contrary, he's saying what North Koreans I myself met said, you know, we're ready to defend ourselves. And the thought that he's planting these fields of corn are just plastic, as some people have actually alleged, plastic. I mean, it's much easier to grow corn and rice than it is to put in plastic fields for hundreds of kilometers. I think that the media and human rights groups, you know, the front groups of the State Department, like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, have been very successful in duping people, not perhaps this audience, but many people, into automatically replying, well, North Korea is bad, the leadership is bad, and everything is bad there, and what you saw is all fake. In August, in a Forbes essay in North Korea, I was actually quite surprised. There was some of the usual rhetoric, but I also saw some interesting admissions of truth. The author wrote, Pyongyang, he had been there before, Pyongyang looks much more like a normal city than 25 years ago. There were no private cars and few government ones. I wondered why they bothered with traffic lights. Today there is traffic. It's not much by US standards, but there's no longer the ghostly scene of empty boulevards. Visitors on longer tours with more guides often have more meaningful information, informal interaction with the real North Koreans. It's one of the reasons I believe that banning travel to the north is foolish and counterproductive. And I agree with that. I mean, granted, you aren't able to run amok, but in a country that is being threatened with destruction, or in a country that has terrorists, like in Syria, where I've been 7 times since 2014, and it has terrorists from all around the world committing heinous crimes against civilians. Security measures need to be taken, and they have the right to take measures, and to a certain degree in the North Korea there is a control of information. But that doesn't mean you can't have genuine interactions, and I had many genuine interactions at a waterfall in the south near the DMZ, with a group of Koreans picnicking like I'd seen Koreans picnic in South Korea, where I lived for 2 years. And I noticed a lot of the same, well, I mean, obviously the same cultural mannerisms, because it is, in the end, one state, one country, one culture. It's been artificially divided. But also in public spaces like a zoo I went to, or an amusement park I went to, I was able to, through a translator, interact with people. And, when I brought up the subject of American aggression, it was always, we're ready to defend ourselves, but we don't want war. And that was also said to me by some students in a high school I visited, and by academics of the University of Social Sciences that I met with in Pyongyang. There have been recent accidents, in line with fear-mongering over North Korea. On January 13th in Hawaii, there was the error of the warning system for long-range missiles going off for 38 minutes by accident. And then 2 days later in Japan, an alert about a North Korea missile was sent out by a national broadcaster, recalled after 2 minutes, but nonetheless causing unwarranted fear amongst the population. And coincidentally, these fake warnings occurred around the time that imperialist leaders convened in Vancouver, Canada, holding a closed meeting about North Korea, which excluded China, Russia, and North Korea, and included all the imperialist nations that aided the destruction of North Korea. In the talk about Korea's North, the rhetoric about their leader, what leaders and media omit are the people, the 25 million people held hostage by America's aggressive policies. Sanctions, which deprive all necessities of life, and the war drills. So I will get back to North Korea, but as also another nation dear to me, because it is a wonderful, and former speakers have addressed Syria, a wonderful country. The people are amazing, hospitable, generous, welcoming, some of the most loving people I've ever met. And yet, what's been done to them, this criminal 7-year war against their country, began with some common narratives, which unfortunately duped many people who perhaps weren't aware of what was going on. And a colleague and writer who I have deep respect for, Sharmin Narwani, who's written many amazing and pivotal articles on Syria, I would recommend you look her up, in early 2012 wrote, 4 key narratives were spun ad nauseum in every mainstream media outlet, beginning in March 2011 and gaining steam in the coming months. The dictator is killing his own people. The protests are peaceful. The opposition is unarmed. This is a popular revolution. And in my own 7 visits, I traveled quite extensively in areas where there were not bearded Wahhabis who would want to cut my head off. But I was able to speak with Syrians from all over the country because, again, an omission in the corporate media is there are at least 7 million internal refugees in Syria. They're being housed largely by the government, sometimes with families, sometimes they manage for themselves, but they are being given housing, food, education, medical aid by the government. And if you were to visit one of the camps in neighboring countries, you would see them living in tents and not getting any of that. But also when you interact with these internally displaced Syrians in places like Latakia or Tartus or even Damascus, Sweda, you can hear their stories why they fled, for example, from Aleppo. And it's not because of their leader bombing them, it's because of the terrorists that entered their areas, took over their areas, menaced their families. And so they fled to a different area to restart their lives. But anyway, back to the narratives. I could speak at length about things I've seen in Syria, and you're welcome to visit my blog, and I highly recommend a number of other writers like Vanessa Beeley, Tim Anderson, Sharmin Narwani. But I'd like to focus on a narrative that has persisted and which continues today, and that is of starvation, and the starvation being that any hunger and starvation that goes on in Syria is the fault, apparently, of the Syrian government and sometimes the Russians. For many of you here tonight, December 2016 was likely a month you remember very clearly, and hopefully, like myself, it was both a month of joy and also a month of surprise, because in December 2016, Aleppo was fully liberated of al-Qaeda, of the child beheaders of Nuruddin al-Zinki, of Ahrar al-Sham, which are listed as a terrorist in the U.S. congressional documents, and other extremist factions who had reigned in that city for years and who had made life hell for the people living there. And while I wasn't on the ground in December 2016 when it was liberated, I did, prior in November when I was there, take testimonies from one family that managed to flee eastern Aleppo from Al-Halak. And they said exactly what people who were later liberated would say. They said the terrorists, and they call them terrorists, they don't call them rebels. They call them terrorists, and they said the terrorists stole our food. They said that the terrorists didn't give us medical treatment. They gave treatment to their own first. And, Vanessa Beeley, who was there in December 2016, took very harrowing testimonies. And I would really encourage you to go to her YouTube account and hear from Syrians from eastern areas of Aleppo themselves. But in any case, corporate media described the liberation of Aleppo as Aleppo falling, while Syrians in Aleppo were finally celebrating the full liberation of their city, and in fact the first time they could celebrate Christmas, because Aleppo does have a Christian population. However, although I wasn't there for the liberation, I was in Syria years prior, and I was in places like Homs, which at one point was dubbed the capital of the revolution. And I was in Old Homs 2 months after it was secured, and in a deal similar to Aleppo, extremists were bussed out. And given safe passage, I'd like to note, the Syrian government adhered to their promise, and they gave these terrorist factions who had committed horrible crimes safe passage, because that's what they promised to do, to restore safety to areas. And so Old Homs which is also actually a large Christian population, had been ravaged by these terrorists. And I was able to speak with one family, the Ahras family, who had stayed there. And they had lost considerable weight because it wasn't the Syrian government was starving them, it was the terrorists that had thieved every last morsel of their food. And I spoke with a friend of the late Father Franz van der Loot, who was a Dutch priest who lived in Aleppo, or in Homs, I'm sorry. And he was 75 years old when he was assassinated point blank by one of these freedom-loving, democracy-bringing, moderate terrorists. And he was interesting because he didn't take a side. He neither sided with the government nor with the so-called rebels, but he did very early on write of witnessing armed men among the early protests who began to shoot at the police first. Very often the violence of the security forces has been a reaction to the brutal violence of the armed rebels. So his testimony, and also there's another priest, Father Daniel, who also has spoken words that people like, Russian propagandists like myself would say, because we're hearing it. I say that mockingly, obviously. These priests have spoken the words of Syrian civilians. And the thing is, our media has completely isolated those people. They've ignored those voices. I had an experience in January 2017 giving a panel in Montreal, Canada. And there were two Canadian journalists there who proceeded to grill me and then write their little story, calling me all these things that we've talked about. But at that panel, there were many, many Syrians. And so I said to them, look, you want to talk about Syria? This room is full of Syrians. But unfortunately, although there were some Christian Syrians, there were a lot of Sunni Syrians, including from Aleppo. And what they had to say did not fit the scripted narrative of these two Canadian journalists. So they were ignored. But in getting back to in Syria, excuse me, I also, in December 2015, I visited the outskirts of a place called Al-War Homs, which was at the time occupied by different extremist factions. One notable thing I noticed there, standing at the last checkpoint and seeing roughly 100 meters away the checkpoint of the militants, was that people were entering and exiting. And this was an area that was under partial siege, and the siege was on the extremists. But also there was a large, like a bread factory right near the checkpoint, and the flour was being provided by the Syrian government, and the bread was being sent into Al-War. Even though when I later went there, I learned that militants were taking the bread, terrorists were taking the bread, and they were taking all the food and aid that went in. And I also, on that December 2015 visit, did see truckloads of food going in. Al-War was another place that the media, although maybe not as hyped up as Aleppo and other areas, but the media did put all the blame for suffering on the Syrian government. And when I went there in June 2017, I heard the same thing. The terrorists stole our food, and we're glad they're gone now. Now, in June 2017, I visited a place you might be familiar with, and if you're not, you either don't have a TV or you were off the internet for January 2016. It's Madaya. Has anybody here heard of Madaya? Yeah. Have you heard of Madaya's starving? Did you know that Saudi terrorist Abdullah Mahaisni was the originator of that hashtag? And of course, he had the best interest of Syrian civilians in mind when he created that. But in January 2016, overnight, Madaya was the new campaign, and virtually all corporate media were reporting on starvation in Madaya. They were using images that even came from Lebanon and other parts of the world in their efforts to say these people are starving in Madaya. Now, there was starvation, but what media negated was that in October the year prior, the Red Cross and other aid agencies had sent in truckloads of food, enough to last for 2 months. So where did that food go? And they also negated a very important issue, and that is the full siege of Fu and Kafraya in Idlib since March 2015. These villages, since that time and even prior, were under partial siege by the terrorist brigades, including Al-Qaeda, the terrorist brigades of Jaish al-Fatah, or the Army of Conquest. And the people in these villages are on a daily basis subject to mortar and missile terrorism and sniping, and they're starving and deprived medicine. And yet, the corporate media does ignore them, or if they mention them as Shia villages. as if somehow their religious affiliation makes them less of a human being. In Madaya this June, I saw life on the streets as normal in areas of Syria. I also saw a bomb factory hidden behind a large apartment building, out of the way of any sort of Syrian army abilities to target it. And above that bomb factory was a storage room in which, at least one storage room, in which terrorist factions stored the food and medical aid that came into Madaya. And just outside the bomb factory was an empty ICRC or Red Cross parcel that was kind of an indicator, and I was told that the storage above the bomb factory had been, the room above the bomb factory had been a storage. So these were some interesting things I noted, but more importantly, I heard the testimonies from civilians again saying that the reason they had suffered any starvation was that not only did they hoard the food, but if they sold it to them, they sold it for 3, 4, 5 times the price. So they could not even afford, a kilogram of rice. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of my June 2017 visit to Syria was meeting the boy in the ambulance, Amran Daknish. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard of the boy in the ambulance, and you've seen this epic photo of an adorable boy with, cute hair, and he was dusty-faced and looking surprised. And the way corporate media spun it was that in August 2016, he was injured, and his family was injured in a Syrian or Russian airstrike. To my knowledge, not many in corporate media today have bothered to go to Aleppo and speak with Amran and his father, Mohammed Daknish. And Mohammed Daknish said, there were no airstrikes. I heard no airstrikes. He said there was some sort of blast. While he was searching for his family members and putting them in a safe room, his boy, Amran, was snatched. Next thing he knew, Amran is a worldwide sensation. He's the face of suffering in Syria. And I can attest to you, there are thousands of Amrans in Syria. And his father insisted that Amran was not seriously injured. He had a light injury, and it did not merit the attention. And it did not merit the crocodile tears of Mahmoud Raslan, who was the photographer that took the famous photo that circulated the world of Amran in the ambulance. Now, in an interview to one of the British newspapers, Raslan said he cried for Amran and his injuries. But Mahmoud Raslan is buddies with Nuruddin Azinki. So I wonder, did Mahmoud Raslan cry for Abdullah Isa when these terrorists savagely beheaded the boy in 2016? I doubt it. So there is one more elephant in the room when it comes to war propaganda constructs on Syria, and that is the entity known as the White Helmets. And my colleague and dear friend Vanessa Beeley, had she been here tonight, would have been addressing that. She has by far done the deepest research into this entity and their funding and their founding, and also following up on the ground in Syria, including taking testimonies from people in Aleppo, as I mentioned, but also including visiting various Syrian civil defense stations and speaking with them and learning about the real Syrian civil defense established many decades ago, unlike the White Helmets established in 2013. So we are told that this group is neutral, nonviolent, and they are volunteers and have saved tens of thousands of civilians in Syria. But in short, the group is not neutral. They are very partial. They work exclusively in Al-Qaeda and other terrorist areas. And they are not all nonviolent, some of them may be, but their own videos show them present at executions, show them holding weapons, show them holding weapons in their White Helmets uniforms and while cheering with Al-Qaeda. So very clearly not the impartial group that we're told they are. In April 2015, American writer Rick Sterling wrote, "Despite the name, Syrian civil defense was not created by Syrians, nor does it serve Syria. Rather, it was created in by the UK and USA in 2013. Civilians from rebel-controlled territory were paid to go to Turkey and receive training in some rescue operations. The program was managed by James Le Mercier, a former British soldier and private contractor whose company is based in Dubai." So then, this is in 2015, and Vanessa Beeley as I've mentioned, has very diligently exposed their funding, which is now at least $150 million from UK, US, and other states and other bodies. And given that now the White Helmets have, again, in spite of all this exposure of their nefarious affiliations, they've again been lauded and they're being praised in the media again as heroes. I think it's fitting to show this brief few-minute video which summarizes who are the White Helmets.
Also known as Syrian Civil Defense, claimed to be an impartial non-government organization campaigning for Syrians. But despite the name, the White Helmets was not created by Syrians, nor does it serve Syria. Meet James Lemessurier, a consultant for the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office and former British Army officer. So what is a non-Syrian British foreign policy consultant doing establishing a NGO in a foreign country? Does James really have the Syrian people's best interests at heart? If so, why do the White Helmets operate solely in terrorist-held areas? Why has the White Helmets constantly called for the implementation of a NATO-imposed no-fly zone? The same kind of no-fly zone that has destroyed Libya for decades. A no-fly zone in Syria would only benefit those who seek regime change and ultimately hurt the Syrians who are already targeted by illegal sanctions. The fact is, the White Helmets are nothing but a propaganda tool for the US and UK administrations to justify military action against the Syrian government. But the White Helmets insist on being impartial and unarmed, yet here is some footage that says otherwise. Here's where it gets interesting. Meet Raad Saleh. He currently leads the White Helmets inside Syria. He was set to accept an award from Interaction, an alliance of international aid agencies, but was refused entry into the US due to his visa being cancelled for unknown reasons. 27th of April 2016, US Deputy Spokesperson Mark Toner was confronted by journalist Matt Lee about the White House's inconsistency regarding the White Helmets.
You commend this group, you're going to continue to support them, and yet you revoked the visa of their leader? That makes zero sense to me.
Well,
what's exactly...
And then when asked who funded and supported the White Helmets, Mark replies,
Well, I can tell you that we provide through USAID about $23 million in assistance to them.
$23 million. Wait a second. Are the White Helmets not, and I quote, fiercely independent and accepts no money from governments? So we have seen a group who is clearly not Syrian, not impartial and not independent, who are armed and are most certainly sectarian. Maybe the White Helmets were set up to facilitate executions like this one. The brave, impartial White Helmets arrive at the scene within seconds of the execution, as if they were on standby, ready to collect the body. The White Helmets. An NGO? Or simply Al-Qaeda with a facelift?
As Vanessa is not here, I'd like to quote something she wrote of her time in eastern Aleppo. She said, "I was in East Aleppo during its final liberation from Nusra Front-led extremism, and during the lead-up to Christmas until the 27th of December. I witnessed the emaciated civilians arriving at the Jibrin Registration Center to receive food, hot drinks, and medical treatment. Medical treatment that the Nusra Front-dominated extremist groups had refused them. We saw a young boy whose foot was missing, He told us he had received no attention for his wounds prior to arriving in Jibrin. He had been injured in a terrorist mortar attack on the district he'd been living in. She says, I was in East Aleppo between the 9th and 14th of December when the majority of districts were liberated. Every civilian I spoke to said the white helmets were effectively Nusra Front's civil defense. And she goes on, but with all the documentation out, you'd think that corporate media might try to regain some respect and regain your respect and investigate them, but instead what they did was they launched a smear campaign against many of us who've looked into the white helmets, but primarily against Vanessa Beeley. So in December, The Guardian had a tech writer from California write the smear campaign after, in October, having sent emails to myself and Vanessa Beeley, basically saying, are you paid by the Syrian government? We know you are, kind of thing. And the piece was had a heavy dose of Russophobia, of course, and which is the focus of many Guardian pieces, but also did not address any of these key and critical issues. And regarding their Russophobia, they were trying to say that this, challenging of the white helmets narrative is emanating from Russia. It's all just this big Russia plot and scam. But as I outlined in a rebuttal that I wrote to this piece, in September 2014, Canadian independent journalist Cory Morningstar was the first that I'm aware of who looked into the white helmets. And she did so looking at the New York-based public relations firm called Purpose Inc. And Morningstar wrote, the White Helmets was one of 4 anti-Assad NGOs or campaigns created by Purpose Inc. And she noted, the message is clear. Purpose wants the green light for military intervention in Syria, well cloaked under the guise of humanitarianism, an oxymoron if there ever was one. So that was 2014, and several writers after her started to investigate this group, including Vanessa Beeley, long before, I have to say, before I'm aware of any Russian media reporting on it. And it's great that they do report on it now, but the whole point is this is not a scam emanating from Russia. This is independent journalists doing what corporate media are covering up. I want to address that both the US and Israel have used chemical weapons on civilians. I lived in Gaza for 3 years and was on the ground in 2009 when Israel used white phosphorus widely on civilian areas throughout Gaza. And I documented some of the remnants of white phosphorus, this one in sponge form, and if you poke at it, it starts flaring up again. And I met a family in Shifa Hospital, the main hospital in Gaza City, during the bombings, and I also met with them afterwards and heard their horrific testimony of essentially losing half their family members, 8 or 9 people, to the white phosphorus bombings on their home. And yet, neither America nor Israel has been held accountable for its use of chemical weapons on civilians, and both America and Israel have appalling hypocritical gall to accuse the Syrian government of using chlorine or sarin against its civilians. And none of these claims have been substantiated. They've been claimed, but they've not been substantiated. They've not been investigated. And in fact, at least in one example, Khan al-Asl, it was shown that the rebels were most likely, if not definitely, the culprits of the chemical weapons attack. Yet this is one of these narratives that has been spun in the attempts to vilify. By the way, on the note of Palestinian rescuers, I just want to say none of the rescuers I worked with in Gaza behaved like a white helmet. They were too busy doing their job. They weren't posing for photo ops. Canadian lawyer Christopher Black, who also has visited North Korea, recently wrote, the American threats against North Korea continue to mount, and with them the threat of genocide of the people of North Korea by the United States of America and its allies. The meeting of the USA, Canada, and other nations which attacked North Korea in 1950, held in Vancouver, Canada, which some hoped would lead to a political solution, instead took on the character of a meeting of criminals who, by their presence, agreement, and actions, made them parties to a conspiracy to commit genocide against North Korea. Now, Peter Ford mentioned the at least 800 U.S. military bases around the world, foreign bases. And one hopeful piece of news I want to offer, although it is only a start and it's an uphill battle, is in the United States, a new coalition has formed to address this root problem of U.S. foreign bases, and they formed to shut down the foreign bases. And one of the coalition members, Ajamu Baraka, was a VP candidate in the last elections, and I spoke with him a couple weeks ago and about this issue. And he and the anti-war groups he works with and for whom he writes maintain the basic stances of being against America's sense of entitlement to invade, to occupy, to bomb, and otherwise interfere in the workings of sovereign nations, no matter what the false so-called humanitarian pretext. The bottom line is respect the sovereignty of nations. Today in Derry, I saw a statement, and I want to read part of it. We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and the unfettered control of Irish destinies, to be sovereign and indefensible. This is what it's about. Syria, Palestine, Venezuela, North Korea, and every nation that is under the target of the imperialist guns. It's about their sovereignty and the right to determine their own futures. All of us here tonight and around the world, writers, activists, politicians, anti-war groups, we're opposed to the continued threats of extermination by imperialist nations to countries who refuse to cower to their demands. We're fighting for human beings far away from the offices in which journalists produce their smear, vilification, and war propaganda pieces. Human beings which the corporate media disappears in favor of war propaganda and fear-mongering. Human beings far away from the offices in which ruthless imperialist decision-makers choose to invade, further occupy, or bomb another country. Being a Russian propagandist, a Kremlin agent, a DPRK stooge doesn't actually pay. But speaking truth in the face of mountains of lies is a moral thing to do. Human lives are at stake. Thank you.